I teach kindergarten at Glendale Elementary School.
And today our presentation is going to focus on report card and systems of assessment in early childhood education. Just to give you kind of a rundown of what we're going to do, first we're going to go over problem definition. We're going to explain how it looks like to the different stakeholders, the parents, the teachers, and the administrators. Then we're going to go into our recommended solutions, and then we're going to finish with the details of implementation, and that's going to include our timeline and budget.
So before we get too far into it, let's take a look very briefly at the current early childhood report card. It's a little hard to see it here, but you can see it on page 2 of your handout. And what you should notice right away is that non-core subjects, health, social studies, are given the exact same weight as core subjects like literacy. You have a lot of disparate skills lumped within those subjects to create one grade. Comments are selected from a list, and that list is actually the same from pre-K all the way through later grades in high school and in middle school. Grade meaning, it's really hard to see down there at the bottom, but there's 4 grades, P, R, I, P, E, M, and D. And that's not entirely clear what exactly those mean or what that refers to in each subject area. I think there's a lot of extraneous information. Like if you look at the left side, you can see a GPA summary for a kindergartner, it's 0.0, and academic marks down there in the bottom left. This is because this report card is actually the same as the high school report card. You can look right here, and it is, nothing has changed even a little bit, really. In high school, they teach things like algebra and biology, whereas in kindergarten, you're teaching things like letter sounds, colors, sight words, but nowhere will you see that actually reflected in the report cards.
So that brings us to our problem, and our problem is that the current early childhood report card doesn't capture or clearly communicate student progress and mastery. So what that looks like for parents is that parents aren't giving the most meaningful information about their students. They may get a score that says in language and literacy, the student is doing ND, but they don't necessarily know how they can improve that. Is it letter sounds? Is it letter identification, sight words, and so forth? For teachers, you really can't rely on the report card to communicate with parents because there's kind of like there's kind of like a layer lost in there. And it's also not very useful for capturing useful data. The data that you pull from the report cards, you can't use the data utilization. It's something that's not necessarily applicable. For administrators, you kind of lose something because you can't use report cards to accurately monitor student and teacher success. How a student is doing in one class could be very different from how students do in another class. It's very different.
So we surveyed parents to find out exactly what they would like to see on a report card. And in blue, you can see the parents responded very helpful, and in red, the parents responded somewhat helpful to each of the 4 items here. And basically the main takeaway from this is that over 90% of parents wish that the report card had personalized comments, wish that the report card made strategies to work on skills at home, showed progress towards end-of-year goals, and listed the specific skills that their students needed to be successful in a given grade. In addition to surveying parents, we surveyed teachers, and we found that teachers would also support some of these measures. Most of the teachers that we surveyed would support being able to write their own custom comments, and most of the teachers that we surveyed would support switching to a standards-based report card. But the critical data point we think is at the bottom right here, when we ask, does the current report card system accurately capture what is most important? And we have less than 10% of teachers who respond yes to that question.
So that's going to bring us to our recommended solutions. And part of our proposal here is actually sorry about that. What we're going to do is, first off, when we think about the concept of report cards, you see, why is it such a big difference? And the big takeaway point is that small hinges swing big doors. We think that this is really critical in order to push student success forward. So how can we be better? How can we improve the report card? Well, first thing we can do is we can show the specific standard that the student is assessed on. So in terms of like the different skills, how they're doing on the different skills. We can show the end of the year goal for that specific skill. We can also show how the student is progressing towards that goal. Is the student on track to meet that goal? And then the other point is include an open comment box for each student. So rather than have a more generic comment box, we have something where a parent, a teacher can actually give a customized response. And our 3 components is our proposal has 3 major components. First off, we have a standards-based report card, and connected to that is an aligned assessment. And the aligned assessment would actually be reflected in the report card. And then the next part of that is an explanatory supplement, which really kind of explains how we come about the different scores that they get in the report card. Like how do we test a student, and so forth.
So on the second page of your packet, you can see a proposed mock-up of the report card. You can see that here. But basically, key things to notice are there's basically 2 kinds of standards. So we assess on in kindergarten, we have standards that spiral all year long towards an end-of-year goal like letter identification, sight words, counting, and then standards that are a little bit more discrete, kind of a yes or no question, whether or not the student can demonstrate it. And that's reflected 4 letters right away, and they can tell what the limits are very quickly. For standards that are more discrete and sort of yes or no standards, we assess on a 4-point scale from needs practice to get skill, approaching standard, meets skill standard, and exceeds skill standard. And also, critically, we have a place that indicates to parents that the standard has not yet been assessed. So for standards in math that we don't get to until the end of the year, parents can see that sort of thing right away. It's very clear, it's upfront, and it's explained out to parents. But the final part of this is that, go back to that just a second, you see where it says see page 2 on there? It'll actually tell a parent what page in this proposed explanatory supplement they can turn to learn about the standard. So you can see the skill for letter identification, you can see the skill, you can see the quarterly goals, and finally, we think most critically, you can see how you can help. So parents can see what their child needs to know at each point of the year and are given strategies for assisting at home. This would be especially critical if we translated it into multiple languages for helping students, parents of ESOL students, who teachers might otherwise have difficulty communicating with. The final part of our proposal is an aligned set of assessments. This is a piece of the current assessment system that we use in early childhood education. We could use parts of this, but we obviously have to grow it, because what we have right now is just for reading, to include some sort of phonics piece, a writing piece, and a math piece, and maybe science, social studies, and behavioral and social development. Obviously, these would be assessments that are given in a one-on-one setting with the child for the most part, rather than in a not developmentally appropriate standardized test-based setup.
So that brings us to how we implement this. And what we have is we have our implementation overview. And what this would take is that before the school year, what we would do is we would actually prioritize the standard and develop the report card. We would also develop the aligned assessments, create the supplemental packet in multiple languages, and on a one-day report card boot camp for teachers. And this is just so that teachers can get more familiar with the new system and understand how it works. This brings us to during the school year. During the school year, what we would do is we would repurpose existing PD days to essentially train EC teachers in the new system. We provide substitute teachers to kindergarten teachers to allow for one-on-one assessments as needed. And another component of this is for parents. We'd also introduce the system to parents at orientations, at back-to-school night, and also during our conferences. And then after the school year, we would survey participants and incorporate the lessons learned for the next year. So what we have is we have really 2 options in how this would work. Our first option is a school-based reform option. And in this option, this is something that we could implement in the next coming school year, for example. And this is where schools choose to adopt the new report card toolkit. This is school-by-school basis. And this it would start small and it scales up. It allows time to refine materials and procedures that are needed, and it allows schools to really have ownership of this report card. Like, this is something we want to do, and we think this would be really important for our students. The downside to this is you also lose some uniformity in report cards across the county. So a report card at one school would look very different, possibly from a report card at another school. Our second model is a county-wide reform model. And this would be something that we would need a little bit more time to implement, and this is something that we would see at the 2012-2013 school year. And this is where we create a system-wide reform. The uniformity report card from school to school would be great. First of all, the same report card in every school. But then you also have the option where it has potential to be viewed as forced, that the schools don't have ownership of it, so you kind of lose some of that.
We budgeted this out at 3 different levels. The essential parts of this, as far as funding goes, is we absolutely have to have some summer development costs. We have the additional printing costs for sending home the supplementary booklets each time, and the translation costs associated with that, and an initial training PD. We highly, highly recommend that if we were to implement this, that money be found to provide kindergarten teachers especially with sub-coverage to assess the students in a one-on-one setting. Many schools already provide this several times a year for the DRAs. What we'd like to see is that the county provide either 2 days or 4 days. At 4 days, that costs about $450 to $600 a teacher. Ultimately, though, this is about kids.
And what this does is it makes our students more prepared in the early childhood grades.
By making them more prepared, we can get them ready for college, their careers, and their future lives.
And what happens now matters later.
And with that, we thank you for your time, and we open the floor to questions.
Is the floor open for questions or just us? All right, I gotta move on. So what's stopping you from going to Sanchez?
mean, I made that proposed mock-up in Excel. I think you probably want to use something a little bit more enterprise grade than jQuery Excel-based report card.
So how many standards is too many standards for a report card? So you talk about the prioritizing standards. Really, when you think about pre-K or K, we could be looking at 150 standards. We could be looking at 5.
I think there's been some good research on that, what other schools and counties are doing. But ultimately, we focus on critical literacy standards and critical math standards and critical personal and social development standards. And I think you could probably winnow that down to, I mean, just off the top of my head, I know that I focus on 10 specific standards in kindergarten and math. And I can imagine doing roughly the same for literacy and maybe
Which sounds like it might be reasonable from a reader's point of view. Respond to this comment. We're in a standards-based environment, but we're about to move into a more holistic Common Core environment, where in fact the number of letters you know might not be as important as your ability to engage in text at a certain level. How do you reconcile the holistic approach to learning as opposed to discrete standards?
I think that in the model that we created, I think we can actually incorporate that, a lot of those kind of holistic things. Like what we focused on and what we showed in our examples are a lot of like things like letter identification, letter sound, and so forth. But I think that you can also incorporate other things like behavioral things of that sort into the same model as long as you create it. So now we're actually talking about, do we have enough time to do this? So we're now actually talking about a transition now. So you can have standard-based report card. You just list your standards. But moving to a more holistic global behavior, are you showing readiness for kindergarten? Are you showing evaluation with peers? Do you interact with adults? Suddenly we're now around more holistic, and that becomes much more challenging as far as scaling. And then we have greater reliability issues. But you have to be thinking, you have to know, people in this room have to know that we are in a transition right now. The beginning of this transition is from a discrete standard to more of a holistic approach to learning as represented by Common Core. So we're going to have to consider that as we adopt the model.
I think that, ultimately, those are very legitimate questions to be asking, but we need to consider relative to what we have right now, the improvement that this would be. I think that is significant enough to move forward.
And then just a final comment. We use SchoolMax as a platform, but the SchoolMax is very inflexible, and its inflexibility is cost effective. So as we move into more electronic platforms that allow for flexibility, the cost significantly increases, both on the programming and the maintenance. So as you think about moving in that electronic platform, your cost will.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff could be developed on a small school basis, on a or for the that's basically what we provided the two options: the toolkit that we could sort of drop into schools if they elected into it, and that we think could be a lot less enterprise grade than something we want to roll out on the whole county at one time.
I do have just a question or a comment. First and foremost, I like the presentation. I was sitting here nudging Dwayne, going, "How come we don't do this now?" The second part of this is that you talk a lot about what parents feel is important with respect to information for students. And I know the two of you both are colleagues essentially at the same level, but we also have a large number of colleagues, your colleagues, who have been using the old system. And the transformation or the cultural change for those individuals to move from a system that is more discrete, if you will, and to one that is more holistic. Have you? And I know you had a couple of professional development. I think you had $1 sign there for that. But this is, I mean, so the training is one thing. Changing behavior is another. And just this notion of thinking about the change in behavior. You're thinking about this from the value of the information but then how do we get individuals who are used to providing that information in a different way to think this way?
I think one of the big things when we first came up with this proposal and stuff, we talked with a lot of teachers about like, would this be meaningful? Would this be helpful? And what do you think? Well, would this be too time-consuming for you? And the thing that we overwhelmingly saw is that people they supported this idea. They thought that in a lot of ways that we do a lot of this sort of stuff already because we just don't provide it, we don't present it in a meaningful way. And I think that was one of the big components when we talk with teachers is that a lot of this sort of stuff we either gather through MMSR or we gather through informal observations and stuff, but we don't have a way to put it in a presentation way. And I think that was what we hoped for this report card was a way to present that information in a meaningful way.
I guess, I'm sorry, excuse my naiveness, I'm not an education policy person, I'm more of a political person from the county executive. But my question is, you're teaching in the classroom, you know each and every one of your kids, I'm sure, like the back of your hand. And this report card's going to the parents. You're doing this to improve upon the students' lesson plans and so forth. And if you know your students that well, having this new system, how does it really help you as a teacher, I guess is my question.
I think what it helps with is that it guides teachers towards thinking about the standards more directly in education, whereas right now the current system limits you really to putting in numerical grades based off of either assessments or worksheets. And we think that this gives you more flexibility as a teacher to really think about different ways of accessing knowledge that aren't worksheet based. And in kindergarten and pre-K, that's a really critical step forward.
And the other component to it, I think it also shows growth, where we can see where a student is at the beginning of the year, and then we see where the student is at the end of the year with all the different standards. So we see how a student really has been learning and what they've been having difficulty, and you get to see, I think it makes the strengths and weaknesses of the student a lot more clear, not only to the parents, but to the administrators and also to the teachers themselves.
And just to add one comment, add a comment to your statement, I think it also allows the parent to be better able to help their young
If the audience is interested more in this, there's a real energy around standards-based reporting. I think Richards County is way behind the times in how we report. But if you read Rick Wormley's work, he has a pretty cogent cogent argument for why we go to meets the standard, exceeds the standard, approaching the standard. So there's actually a lot of good literature. Also, if you're interested, Rick Stiggins is like the god of assessment. So read Wormley, read Stiggins.
With that, thank you.